Hi, I'm Mary Anne Mohanraj. I'm here today with Vida Cruz. We're at the World Science Fiction Convention in Dublin, and I had just asked Vida to come and talk with the Speculative Literature Foundation a little bit about her experiences in the field. Vida has come to us from the Philippines,
Yeah,
and this is her first WorldCon,
yeah.
and not your first convention, though,
No,
or
unless you count San Diego Comic Con.
yeah, Comic
Yeah.
Con counts.
All right.
So maybe you could just talk a little bit about your. Well, we'll start with what's it like being here as a Philippines writer at the World Science Fiction Convention.
It's amazing. Like I can finally put a face to all the people I talk to on Twitter. You know.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And then there's actually a lot of books here that are not sold in my country, so that's been amazing to me too.
yeah. As someone from, I was born in Sri Lanka, and I have friends who are Sri Lankan science fiction writers, and their entire authors that they can't get access to, who are classics of the field, like Delaney and so on, that it's really challenging to find the books. So, is it a huge cost barrier for even buying books in English? I don't know what the exchange rate is like, or
Oh well, let's see. If it's US dollars, I guess 15 US dollars is about 756 pesos. Last I checked, that's kind of pricey.
yeah. So and then I think in terms of like print books, it's also, I know my Sri Lankan writer friends, like they mostly rely on ebooks because just adding in the shipping costs makes it much more expensive. So at least we have ebooks now as an option. Can I ask what I don't know, the science fiction fantasy writing community is like in the Philippines? I don't really know anything about it.
Well, it's not. How do you put it? It's not banded like a community, like in WorldCon, because we're mostly lumped together with the literary writers. So when you see us in festivals, the panels are every genre all over the place, and they're also more general things instead of like technique things. Does that make sense? Because like, for example, the panels that I wanted to go to were about food and fantasy or how to put together an anthology, and we still get things like intro to writing, SFF, things like that.
Oh, I see. Right. So you're getting much more specialized conversation here at WorldCon than you would have in the Philippines. I think that's interesting. The sort of comment you made about you are considered sort of with the mainstream fiction writers, right? Yeah. I would guess that there are mainstream writers who are also, who might be working with folklore or mythological material, but maybe not science fictional, right? Like that shunts you off into a different category, or no, or maybe not.
It's a blur.
Actually. Yeah. Okay.
It's a really big blur, and well, there's an interesting conversation going on in the Philippines because, well, for example, a lot of our writers are calling for better STEM education because not most Filipinos write fantasy. That's in our blood because we have a lot of epics and folklore and things like that. But science fiction is relatively new in my country, and actually our golden age of SFF began in the early 2000s and it's still ongoing right now. So
Who are some writers that you're excited about? Aside from yourself, aside from Vida Cruz, who else is fabulous? Who should we be reading?
Up and coming?
Up and coming or established? Like when the golden age started? I know Dean Francis Alfar, who does anthologies, right?
His wife, Nikki Alfar, is also great.
Okay.
And
I don't remember the name of the anthology. Is there a name to the anthology series?
Yes, Philippine Speculative Fiction. They do it every year.
Okay, perfect. So,
who's good? Jacob Matthew Ramos. He's just starting out, and he won a Palanca Award last year, and that's our highest award for literature.
Oh, okay.
And he won it for science fiction, which is amazing because there's still genre politics about stories that win Palanca Awards.
Well, that's terrific. Do you know the title offhand, or
no?
Okay, we'll go look it up. Everyone, go look up the Palanca Award, and the author's name again was
Jacob Matthew Ramos.
Jacob Matthew Ramos, who just won last year. So now you've won some things yourself, right? So you've won a Tiptree. Maybe if you can talk a little bit about and Writers of the Future. Could you talk a little bit about both of those?
Sure. With the Tipsy Fellowship, the work I submitted to them was I've been doing a series of news article style fiction where modern day Filipinos live with our mythological creatures side by side in Manila. But I'm still dealing with contemporary politics alongside all of those. So, I have a story coming up in an environmental anthology called Tales. I know, an Invite to Eternity.
Okay.
And that one is about the post-disaster of Typhoon Haiyan a few years ago. And then I have one of the highest of our diwata, or fairies, going around a bunch of islands that were affected and doing relief operations.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's making me think, like, in Sri Lanka after the tsunami, there was a beautiful book by Sonali. I'm going to blank on her last name, so I don't want to get it wrong, but it was called Wave, that was about that, but it's mainstream lit, and I actually don't know if anyone has written any science fiction fantastical work dealing with the aftermath of that. And so it's great to. Is that story out, or is it?
It's just about to come out in November.
From
Calc Press. I think.
Oh, so it's part of an anthology. That's right. So it'll be coming. Invite to Eternity.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. That's great. So that was your Tiptree application story.
Yeah. Well, I had another one of the same series, but this one was talking about if the mythological creatures went to war with the Duterte administration. That was my segment. And I'm actually a little worried about bringing that one out in public because you know how the political climate is right now.
Well, I understand some about the historical Philippines politics, but I'm not necessarily up on like what exactly is happening right now. So would it be a potentially risky story?
At the moment, because you see, there are a lot of readers in the Philippines, but the readers who read science fiction and fantasy, they're a very specialized few. So unless somebody made it viral or something, I don't think it's going to get much spotlight.
All right.
So it's not that risky, but also, who knows?
Right. I know in Sri Lanka and in India, one of the challenges if you're going to do something like apply for a Fulbright is, the governments do read the applications, or I don't know, somehow they look at them and they have to approve them. They have to sign off on them. And so from what I've heard from other writers, is that if you submit something that is heavily critical of the government in some way, you're very unlikely to be to get the grant and be allowed to go there and research.
That
right?
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and so I think, I'm working on something set in ancient Sri Lanka and set at Sigiriya, which is a World Heritage Site, and there was a moment where we're like, oh, maybe we should try to get funding from the government. They might be interested in promoting Sigiriya, but then, of course, this is a video game. We have queer characters in the game, and I'm like, I don't know that the government would be okay with that, and probably we don't want to invite them into that conversation necessarily, right? It may be simpler to just do it separately and then see how they respond, see how things fall. So you also did Writers of the Future.
Yeah.
So how was that experience? What was it like?
Surreal. A lot happens in 1 week, and well, there was a lot of good stuff, and there was also a lot of stuff that I could have done without in terms of racism.
Really, like overt things that from other writers, from the organization?
The judges and the organization. My fellow co-winners were great.
Okay.
And they were really supportive whenever they happened to be in the room and then they hear something quite shocking. So
I hadn't heard about any of this. If you're comfortable, is there any specific incident that you could talk about, or?
Well, like, during one of the workshop classes, somehow they got to talking about my winning story, and then one of the judges said that, when we get a lot of entries from the Philippines every year, and when we picked yours out of the pile, I had to check for plagiarism because it was that good.
Right.
And
one of those backhanded compliments that's really not a compliment, right?
Yeah, and I was just sitting there, and trying not to let my mouth fall open, and I also couldn't look at anyone else because, oh, what must they be thinking? I don't know.
Right. I mean, it's almost like it sounds like an accusation, right? And that's a terrible entry into American science fiction. I'm so sorry, right? I mean, that's terrible that you had to encounter that. You also went to Clarion. How was that? When were you there?
2014.
Okay, and this was in Seattle?
San Diego.
Oh, San Diego. Clarion East. That is now Clarion San Diego.
Yeah.
Yes. And how was it? What were your? Do you have any like particular memories or thoughts about? Is it worthwhile in general? Would you recommend it to other writers from the Philippines or elsewhere?
Let's see. That's like Clarion was one of the best 6 weeks of my life, and I mean, it's not just because of all the craft things that I learned there, but because my classmates were also kind and they were always down for something fun. Like one weekend, they all took me to the zoo, and I'd never seen a giraffe, and I love giraffes. And then they sat at a cafe that was near the giraffe pen, and then I went to the bathroom, and then when I came back, there was one seat left at the table, and they're all looking at me. When I sit down, there's a giant giraffe peeking out over the trees, and I was like, and then it turns out that they had all talked to each other and said, we're going to make sure she sees the giraffe from when she gets out of the bathroom. And that's just so sweet.
That is really sweet. So that's great. It sounds like you had a really bonding experience. Have you, and you've stayed in touch with some of them as
yes.
It's been 5 years, right?
So. Actually, one of them is my roommate right now for Worldcon.
That's great. I think one of the things we've been, in one of our other interviews, we were talking to George R. R. Martin, and he really emphasized the value of being able to come to these conventions, come to, places like Clarion, just for that human networking. I mean, networking makes it sound very businessy, which is not really what I mean, but the
relationship
building, community building, and like it's scary, I think, walking into some of these rooms on your own, right? When you came from the Philippines, so what made you apply to Clarion? How did you hear about it? And
actually, I applied the year Neil Gaiman was teaching Clarion West, and I didn't get in, but I got a really good feedback from the committee. And then, so I was like, okay, maybe not this year. And also, I just graduated from college then. And then the next year, I just happened to look because, I was like, this is going to be a bucket list thing. And then I saw N.K. Jemisin and Kat Valenti on the list of instructors. And I was like, oh no, I got to try. I mean, even if I don't get in, I mean, it's kind of expensive, but I got to try.
Right.
And then I got in. And then I don't even know how I managed to get there. Like, I do recommend Clarion, but there are lots of barriers to entry. Like, for example, I did have one Filipino friend who made it this year, both to Clarion West and to the Milford bursary. And he actually, he was actually granted a bursary from Milford, but he couldn't go to either one because he was denied a visa both to the U.S. and to the UK.
I know that for this Worldcon, we missed a whole set of Nigerian writers who were denied their visas. Not denied, their visas weren't processed in time by the Nigerian government, I think. And so
the Irish one, actually.
Oh, was it the Irish government?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's terrible. And so they were not able to attend. So there are of course these border issues in this world of ours, and which seem to get worse every year right now. Hopefully that trend will reverse soon. But then there's the financial issues, right? I know when I was I think 27 when I was a student at Clarion, and I was completely broke. I was in the middle of an MFA, which I took on quite a bit of debt to do. Maybe not the smartest choice in retrospect, but I did Clarion entirely on credit cards, right? I just put the whole thing on credit cards, said, I don't know how I'm going to pay for this. At some point, I'll figure it out. And I did eventually, but it took quite a while, and I ended up paying probably quite a bit more in credit card fees as a result. So do you have advice, I guess, or things, I'm going to reframe that, rather than advice to young writers, are there ways that you could see the systems change, that whether it's organizations like Clarion or things that could be put in place to make it more possible for writers like you to participate?
Actually, I was able to attend Clarion because they gave me a foundation scholarship. So that took out like 2/3 of the tuition, and then my family just had to make up for the rest of it. And then
the airfare and
yeah, actually,
no, the airfare is a huge barrier, I think.
And then here for Worldcon, I am here by the generosity of Connor Bust. They paid for my airfare and for my accommodations.
Yeah, that's Kate Nepview has been doing incredible work with that organization for so long, bringing writers and fans of color to various cons around the world. So that's really great to hear. Yeah. If anyone listening would like to look for an organization to support, Connor Bus would be a great one to throw some pennies at, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
So, all right, well, we're almost out of time. We have to run off to other things. So maybe I will just close with, if people were going to look for you in your work, what might you recommend that they read? You've been published, you've had stories published in a few places, and so maybe a starting point, and your website, or how should they find you?
All right, well, I have 2 stories up on Expanded Horizons. You just Google that with my name, Vida Cruz. And they're both Filipino-oriented stories, and they're also emotional, I would say. So I hope that's something that you'd be into. My website is vidacruz.org. You can find me on Twitter and on Instagram as well, but Instagram is for my art. So
and we didn't even get to talk about your art, so another time. So that's terrific. So thank you. Thanks so much, Vida Cruz. This is Mary Anne Mohanraj with the Speculative Literature Foundation. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, too.